In the last 4 videos, I've described some different ways of thinking about feminism. Now I'd like to focus on how their content can be used to understand why feminism is so controversial. The first video discussed how we can think about feminism based on the variation that occurs within it. Feminists may differ on how much they want to change society, with some implementing modest tweaks and others leveling more fundamental criticisms. The implication of this is that feminism is not a homogeneous entity, a fact that can generate some disagreements around the term. For example, disagreements may stem fundamentally from a misunderstanding. Consider 2 people who differ based on whether they think feminism is good or bad. This in turn influences their willingness to identify with the label. Yet, upon further examination, you may discover that the person who opposes feminism has a more extreme version in mind, whereas the person who accepts the label has a more moderate form in mind. In spite of their differences when it comes to identifying as a feminist, the 2 may actually have a lot in common. The apparent difference is more of a reflection of how they understand the term, rather than an indication of different beliefs. Yet, if they judge one another based on whether or not they identify as a feminist, and do not take the time to actually understand what the other believes, they may mistakenly conclude that they are in opposition to one another. In this scenario, the distinction is a fiction of their perception and has no grounding in what the other actually stands for. By acknowledging that feminism is a diverse term, this type of error can be avoided. Second, acknowledging the variation within feminism can prevent people from dismissing the claims that adherents or opponents of feminism make. If I believe that feminism is a homogeneous entity, 2 types of errors are possible. First, if I oppose feminism, then I may think that by debunking one feminist, I have debunked them all. Second, if I adhere to feminism, I may think that those who oppose feminism are opposing what I believe. Adopting a more nuanced understanding of the term, however, may cause us to question these assumptions. By addressing the claims of one feminist, one should be cautious in concluding that they have addressed all who identify as feminists. Likewise, if someone disagrees with feminism, feminists should be cautious in assuming that this person necessarily disagrees with them. As with the former point, acknowledging the diversity within feminism can help us avoid this. Finally, the variation within feminism can also give rise to controversy amongst feminists. Disagreements can emerge over how to best address the problems in society and what the movement ought to be fighting for. For example, if you recall from the previous video, intersectional feminism emphasizes the need for feminists to move beyond merely focusing on sexism, and to also take into account racism, classism, and a host of other social factors. As a result, those who do not take this approach are criticized for advancing an inadequate form of feminism. This scenario illustrates how disagreements occur not only between feminists and non-feminists, but also between feminists of different persuasions. In the second video, I discussed 3 different aspects of feminism. These include the scientific aspect, the moral aspect, and the movement aspect. A large number of disagreements arise within the scientific realm. These deal with broad statements about society at large as well as more specific scientific claims. When it comes to the overall state of society, there are 2 key questions which I think underlie a lot of the disagreement. First, how bad are things for women in society? And second, do women have it worse off than men? It's important to note that the first question deals with the absolute or objective state of women in society, whereas the second deals with how women are treated relative to men. Assessing these views involves evaluating the specific scientific claims that people make about different aspects of society. Researchers may examine things like income, who are the victims of crime, homelessness, what jobs are the most dangerous, and so on. From this, information about how each of these areas affect men and women can be compared. While feminists believe that there are numerous disparities that disadvantage women, critics will claim that feminists tend to over-exaggerate the problems that women face. Likewise, while feminists acknowledge that society does disadvantage men in some ways, critics will charge them with downplaying the unique problems that men must deal with. One's view on these topics are consequential. They can influence whether or not one thinks feminism is still necessary in society. When it comes to the moral component of feminism, there are large areas of agreement. Most people believe that we ought to value equality and that sexist discrimination against women is wrong. It is rare to find someone who, generally speaking, thinks it's okay to infringe upon women's rights and freedoms. However, there are a couple points that can be divisive. Perhaps the most common moral dispute occurs over whether or not women should have the right to have an abortion. Although there are some feminist organizations which claim to be pro-life, the feminist movement has not always been particularly welcoming towards those who oppose abortion. Some have even claimed that one cannot be pro-life and a feminist. As a result, some people who are pro-life reject feminism because they feel that adopting it would conflict with some of the values that they hold. There's also some moral disagreement over how to view the disparities that exist in society. It is common for feminists to claim that women are underrepresented in certain fields, such as politics or engineering. This criticism reflects an emphasis on the equality of outcomes. Adherents to this perspective would, presumably, want the percentage of men and women in a particular field to at least approximately reflect how many men and women are in the population. What this implies is that if roughly 50% of the population consists of women, then roughly 50% of the people in these fields should be women as well. Others, however, disagree with this assessment. While these people agree that women should be free to pursue what they wish in life, they disagree when feminists believe that men and women need to be equally represented in various fields. The removal of all barriers so that people can exercise their own personal liberty is what has moral value, not necessarily the end result. Of course, the view that one has on this issue is often influenced by one's scientific views. For example, some feminists may claim that society has a number of barriers which prevent women from entering certain fields. These oppressive forces are what in turn generate the disparities in society. Likewise, critics of feminism may argue that there are biological differences between men and women which tend to give rise to different lifestyle choices. As a result, the disparities between men and women simply reflect differences between them rather than discrimination. These opposing perspectives illustrate how one's scientific views, in this case what causes gender differences, can influence the moral judgments one makes. There's also a general issue that I have found to be prevalent in moral disagreements between feminists and their opponents. This has less to do with whether something is wrong, but rather with how wrong it is. Such reflects a common idea that most have when it comes to ethics. Things may differ in how bad they are. For example, while stealing a pack of gum and murdering someone are both wrong, most would agree that one is clearly worse than the other. In order to make this judgment, one must acknowledge that goodness or badness occur on a continuum. Similarly, when it comes to moral issues in feminism, people may differ on how severe certain issues are. In some instances, feminists may tend to view social problems that impact women as worse than those who reject the label. This has led critics to claim that feminists are hypersensitive and over-exaggerate how bad things are for women. One of the more common examples where this issue arises concerns catcalling, where some women may perceive it merely as a rude comment that can easily be brushed off, others see it as a hate crime. Finally, the movement component can generate disagreements in a number of different ways. If you recall from the second video, this aspect of feminism emerges when there is a disparity between the scientific component of how things are and the moral component of how things ought to be. When this gap exists, the movement component of feminism seeks to bring the current state of affairs to align with our ideals. What this implies is that disagreeing with feminists over either of these domains will also lead to a disagreement over what the movement aspect is trying to accomplish. For example, in some scenarios people may think that feminists are mistaken in both the scientific and moral realms. In this situation, the feminists' understanding of society is wrong, meaning that what they believe to be a problem may not even exist. Additionally, the solution that they posit will yield a morally undesirable or morally unnecessary outcome. Consider the science on gender differences combined with the moral requirement of equal outcomes in the workplace. Many feminists believe that the differences in occupational choices between men and women are largely due to social pressures and discrimination. This causes them to view these differences between men and women in a negative light. Such gives rise to the moral obligation to bring about the equal representation of men and women in various fields. In response, some would argue that the disparities in society are heavily influenced by biological differences between men and women. The differences which we observe in the choices that men and women make are, to a large extent, an indication of them exercising their free choices. Because these disparities reflect personal liberty, their presence should not be condemned. This position contends that there is no problem that exists, and consequently, there is no solution which needs to be implemented. Those who entertain this perspective will oppose the efforts that feminists make to eradicate the differences between men and women in the workforce. In this example, notice how there is a disagreement in both the scientific and the moral aspect of this issue. This will inevitably lead to disagreements over the movement component. Another possible critique of feminism may claim that the science is wrong and the moral is right. In this scenario, people will agree on how women ought to be treated, but there is much disagreement over how they are actually being treated. The objection against feminism in this situation is that they believe that society is worse off than it really is. As a result, they are trying to solve a problem that doesn't actually exist. An example of this objection is seen when it comes to sexual assault. There are many feminists who claim that we live in a rape culture and that these crimes are extremely common. Critics believe that they are over-exaggerating the risks that women face. As a result, feminists are creating an unnecessary climate of fear and generate overly negative attitudes towards men. In this example, it is not the moral goal that is under dispute. Everyone thinks that sexual assault should not occur. The difference is more about how common feminists believe this crime is, and how this belief influences the way in which the movement component functions. A third objection can emerge when the science is right and the moral is wrong. In this scenario, the feminist view of society is correct, but their ideal of how society ought to be causes them to pursue undesirable ends. This type of critique may emerge in the abortion debate. It is common for feminists to point out the challenges that women face when pregnant, especially if they are single or poor. Offering them access to abortion offers an option that can be helpful for some. Critics, however, may acknowledge that although these struggles are real, this does not necessarily mean that pregnant women ought to solve their problems by having an abortion. Instead, we should support these women in a way that does not involve killing the unborn. Note that in this scenario, both feminists and their critics may agree on the state of society and that change needs to occur. However, their moral values differ. This causes them to pursue different solutions. One may promote pro-life crisis pregnancy centers, while the other may want to secure funding for Planned Parenthood. It's important to note that disagreements over the scientific and/or moral components of feminism necessarily yield disagreement in the movement realm. However, opposition to factual or moral claims are not the only reason why people object to this aspect of feminism. In many instances, it is the specific tactic which is utilized that gets criticized. This critique can be applied to each of the former three scenarios. However, it is probably most clearly illustrated in instances where people agree both with the scientific and moral components of feminism. This creates an interesting scenario in which people are unified on the state of society as well as how it ought to be. The criticisms are therefore confined to how one seeks to bridge the gap between the two. In other words, this is a critique of the means that feminists implement as they address real problems and aim for desirable outcomes. In a handful of instances, the way in which feminists go about addressing problems is seen as odd, ineffective, silly, counterproductive, or degrading. Another point of criticism may claim that feminists bring up some good points, but they don't fully acknowledge the problems that men face. Although they may preach equality, they are biased against the difficulties that society imposes on men, and as a result, have adopted a somewhat lopsided view of the world. In this scenario, the objection isn't so much about what feminists do, but rather about what they don't. Technically, no scientific or moral disagreement needs to occur here. Merely a bias in what one focuses on is sufficient to generate this objection. In a similar line of criticism, some may claim that feminists neglect more serious problems that women face in other countries. One may acknowledge that women in the US and other Western nations face problems, but they are nowhere near what is happening in other countries. As a result, feminists seem hypocritical when they claim to stand for women's rights, yet focus most of their attention on the most privileged women in the world, rather than those who are truly being oppressed. Similar to the former point, the silence of feminism in this domain is seen as problematic. It's also worth giving a few comments on the last two videos I made on the patriarchy and intersectionality. Perhaps what is most noteworthy about these concepts is that they make broad claims about how we are to understand society. As a result, a large portion of what they discuss can be thought of as scientific. What can make these ideas particularly controversial is that they critique society at large. They demand that we make changes to ourselves and to how society is fundamentally structured. Because they level such strong criticisms, it is virtually inevitable that they will receive some criticisms, whether or not their claims are valid. I think it's also worth taking some time to specifically discuss the political component of feminism. Although I think that a lot of what happens politically can be understood more fundamentally in terms of the moral and movement aspects of feminism, there are some important points which I think should be made. Much of this stems from the idea that, in its present form, feminism has become politically skewed. While it may bring up some good issues and push for equality in principle, in practice much of the feminist movement has become dominated by left-leaning, progressive ideologies. As a result, this has caused a number of conservatives and libertarians to feel marginalized by the movement. This, they claim, is what happens when a growing number of vocal feminists hold certain political views and express a degree of intolerance towards those who may differ. It reflects how passionate many feminists are about issues beyond those that directly or primarily affect women, as well as their hesitancy to associate with women who disagree with them. Another criticism in this domain is that feminism often utilizes identity politics. Such is portrayed as a political approach which tends to focus on the interests of various group identities. For example, such may advocate on behalf of women, racial minorities, immigrants, and so on. A common critique, however, is that this approach makes generalizations about groups of people who may, individually, be quite different. When it comes to feminism, there are many women who emphasize that the movement does not speak for them. This is a response to instances where feminists appear to talk about the problems that women face in a way that implicitly assumes that all women agree with them. The cause of this may be that these feminists make the scientific mistake of thinking that all women are the same. This assumption can then cause them to speak on behalf of what they see as a homogeneous group. Or it may be that they make the moral mistake of thinking that all women ought to have the same values, and therefore they overlook those who disagree with them, writing these women off as being against their own self-interest as a result of internalized misogyny. Another option could be that feminists know there is variation amongst women, but simply speak on behalf of women as a whole because addressing the nuanced state of society doesn't advance their political goals. Other possibilities exist as well. Regardless of the underlying reason, however, the result seems to be a number of women who are upset by a movement which, they claim, puts words in their mouths. Hopefully this has offered a useful overview of why feminism can be so controversial. By now it should be clear that there are a number of different reasons and ways in which the term can generate disagreements. Although this video has only scratched the surface of explaining various debates that occur within feminism, it should have at least offered some ways for reflecting on why these disagreements exist. By doing this, hopefully the discussions that emerge around the issues that feminism brings up will be a bit more productive. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.